right. Happy Friday, Dr. Richards.
Happy Friday, Dr. Leib.
How are you this
I'm
evening?
I'm pretty good. It's a little gross out, which I
Yeah,
don't
it is.
love.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's been raining for days on end now, so it's getting to me, but otherwise I'm all good.
It was dry for quite a while, so yeah, the rain's coming in as hard now. It's
Yeah,
coming back with a vengeance.
I know. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm excited. I got a vacation coming up, so tomorrow morning I'm leaving for Ocean City, Maryland. So I'm like,
Oh, nice.
yeah, tying up some loose ends, and then but otherwise I'm excited about that. The kids are excited. Hopefully we don't get all rain, but I keep seeing a different forecast, so we'll just have to see.
Yeah. I feel like the beach just is its own thing. Like
Yeah,
it just changes so much anyway. But
absolutely.
oh, that'll be fun.
Hopefully.
I hope so too. But yeah, good weather.
Good one. All right, so today we're going to go into the topic of osteoarthritis. I figured we would start a process of discussing common orthopedic diagnoses that we see, and also just try to put a different context around them. Right, we can explain them from a like a definition standpoint, but I don't want to make this like we're just reciting something from Wikipedia, but really more bring our clinical experience into it, and also just reframe the idea, especially around how it tends to present itself in a physical therapy realm, and versus like how it might be useful to another healthcare professional, such as a physician or a surgeon, and understanding the difference there, and where like that diagnoses and definitions like this might be useful and where they might actually be not useful or even a bit harmful. So I think osteoarthritis is probably the most common thing that we see, but it also is one of the most general things. And really, I know from my perspective as a therapist, it doesn't have much of a meaning to me anymore because
Yeah.
you see it so frequently and the presentation around it are so different that the diagnosis on paper doesn't really tell you much. It's really, you got to get the person in front of you and get them to move. In your young career, what have you noticed with a diagnosis like that? Um,
It it's just like I think it's just like a catch-all diagnosis.
mhm.
Like if someone comes in over, I mean, honestly, even with young people too, it's like come in with some type of pain and they can't seem to find anything else. It's like, okay, well, you have osteoarthritis. Like,
Right.
and it's just, and then people unfortunately like look up the what happens with that, and it's like, oh, it just worsens over time or whatever it is. And
Yeah.
then there's a whole problem cycle to that. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's just the actual definition is what it is, but I think the actual diagnosis doesn't necessarily help determine what someone's going to look like when you actually see them move or come to you in person.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, what you said there, it really matters that there is this thought process that it's a progressive degenerative problem. And it really depends on how you define osteoarthritis, right? So I think that if you were to look it up on Wikipedia, and I know like the way that I tended to learn it in school was that it is like directly tied into the loss of joint cartilage. Like you're actually losing the cartilage that's part of the ability to decrease friction between the bony surfaces of a joint, and that then creates deterioration that leads to inflammation. But if we just break the word osteoarthritis down, it really is osteo and arthro. So osteo would be bone, arthro would be joint, and then itis is inflammation. It can also just refer to any inflammation that might be in a joint at any time. So it doesn't necessarily need to mean that there's a degenerative process there, but that tends to be what the discussion is, and that tends to be, and certainly in patients of mine, the mentality there that there's this progressive degeneration, as opposed to just, okay, you have joint pain. Like they could be the most general way to just say you have pain in your joint,
Yeah.
right? And that is a totally different framing, because if you have pain in your joint, well, that pain comes and goes, more than the idea of deterioration. That is something that we look at as like, all right, there's nothing I can do about this. I mean, it's going to be a progressive process until I need a new knee or I need a new hip. And that is a lot of times the mantra that will even come from certain orthopedics, where, yeah, you have this arthritis, it's not that bad right now, but there's really nothing you can do about it. Where that to me isn't helpful at all. And then the diagnosis actually becomes problematic and not useful and not really what people are complaining about, right? They're complaining about pain, and they're not necessarily complaining about what the joint image says, but the two then become coupled. That, okay, I had a pain that was limiting me from doing something. Now I went and I got an X-ray or I got an MRI that showed either inflammation in the joint, or it showed what's worse, like some type of wear and tear on the cartilage, and the bones are closer together now. So that starts to be in somebody's head. They just saw a static picture, but it became a dynamic future process for them, where it's like, okay, now this static picture has just given me some type of death sentence for my joint.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just not the case. And it's certainly not anything that would help us as physical therapists make somebody function better.
I think it almost hurts, because it's like,
Right.
what happens when you see the diagnosis and you're told this is progressive is, oh, I need to rest it and stay off it. And then actually things start to feel even worse. And then it's just and then you try to rest it and stay off it even more. And then it's just this progressive cycle. And it's this concept of wear and tear versus wear and repair. And
Right.
as humans, we operate by, to a certain extent, wear and repair. And actually we respond well to loading and activity and things. And there's nuance to that, but it's like the idea that, well, if I'm told I have this problem in my knee, osteoarthritis, and that means maybe I shouldn't walk as much, then eventually I'm going to lose the ability to walk. And
Right.
it's just a cyclical, further ever extending process that actually exacerbates the symptoms in the first place.
Yeah. And we may have to just realize that the diagnosis might not be accurate in the first place. Right.
Sure.
So, there's plenty of evidence, that you can look at that just shows that there's really no association between how much damage or how much deterioration one might see on an image and actually somebody's pain and dysfunction, the severity of it.
Yeah.
Right. And then there's another line of evidence that shows that plenty of people have no pain whatsoever. You give them an MRI or X-ray, and they have actually pretty substantial wear and tear of their joint. They might even have some indications of inflammation at the moment, but not feel pain at that moment. Right. So the two things are just it's like bad science, right? Like what ends up happening is their initial complaint is like, I can't do something because of pain. I go and I see somebody that now they're immediately thinking, what's wrong with the joint that it hurts? So I have to take a picture of it so I can look inside of it, which isn't a bad idea. But then you get results when you take that picture, right? Like you're going to usually find something. And if you don't find something, then sometimes that just now shifts it. Well, you have nothing wrong with you. So now people start thinking it's in their head, where the problem never was looking at the joint. The problem was that the person had pain, which is a totally different thing than thinking about damage to the joint. And it's not that they never are associated. It's just that they're never the same thing. They're never exactly the same thing. And they get put into many patients' heads as, I have pain because I have this damage. If there's nothing I can do, if I don't change the surface of the knee in some way, if I don't change the wear and tear that's happening in my back, I can't imagine ever getting out of this pain, because they can't uncouple the two. Right. Yeah. And I think that's a really big thing, like a really big discussion, to understand that the diagnosis of arthritis may never have been the problem. It may have, but there's a lot of evidence that it may never have. And certainly when we're trying to treat people, it's not the way that we can think. We can't think about their joint degeneration. We have to think about what they're telling us in any moment, and make more of their pain provocation with any action they're trying to do that, they'd like to be able to do better.
Yeah. I think that like that coupling is such a big issue. In some conversations I have a lot with people as well. Like, okay, say you have this diagnosis of what's going on, just say your knee or wherever it is. But your pain actually comes and goes, and sometimes varies with activity and isn't even consistent, to the point that like sometimes you squat and your knee hurts, and sometimes you squat and it feels fine.
Right.
Well, if it were coupled, then that likely wouldn't be the case. Like it would just be feeling the same at all times, if actually what we saw in the image directly correlated to how someone's actually pain and symptoms behave. And I think that's a really hard thing to try to wrap your head around, especially dealing with sometimes like the outdated bio kind of medical model of more so like something has to be wrong with your body for you to experience pain, and not understanding that we can see these things on image, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the reason you have pain.
Right.
But on the other side, I guess it's comforting. It is comforting to a certain extent to be like, I have something wrong. This must be the thing that's wrong.
Yeah. And I think it speaks to like a discomfort with uncertainty in some ways, right? Like, so we try to create certainty around something that's actually more complex, and there's going to be a lot less certainty. So, you know, we use the term like the biopsychosocial model, which just means that everybody's pain always has a mixture of the biology of what's going on inside the body, but also the psychology of the danger and the threat of anything in any moment. So like the threat of something will be more of what's causing the severity of the pain than the actual damage. But if you feel like damage, now you're more aware of damage in your knee, that's going to be a bigger threat, right? So there's a lot of variables to that, and we can use these terms, but it actually isn't telling us exactly what to do. It's in some ways just like muddies the water. It makes it more complex, and that could be, like you said, less comforting in many ways, because now it's like, oh shit, like what do I do about this? Now you're just using a bunch of terms that I don't know what they mean, as opposed to it was actually a lot easier to understand if it was just like, okay, my joint, my bones are getting closer together. The problem with that is it's a very bleak diagnosis, and it's inaccurate, right? Like, so just because you want certainty doesn't make it truth, right? And I think that becomes the problem over time. Is there's a lot of chronic pain in this world, and certainly in our country, we treat it all the time, and the diagnosis of arthritis hasn't helped it that much, right? It's like getting the right diagnosis, or getting a diagnosis that's comforting because it seems less complex, doesn't necessarily allow you to get out of pain any better. And sometimes it causes interventions that aren't necessary. And even after you get those interventions that change the joint, you're left with pain. You still have to figure out something else to do. So being more educated on more possibilities up front, I think, help that process, even if there's not a concrete certainty, of what's going on. And I think, again, that has to be part of our job, is to educate, but not try to drive certainty down people's throats, right? Not lecture like this is right, but just say like, no, here's a bunch of different possibilities. This is kind of what the evidence would show. And this is, just look at it a little bit differently, because you may have to prepare yourself that this isn't the problem that you're thinking it is.
Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned kind of talking about different ways of, I guess, moving, or different things we can actually do from an activity standpoint to potentially affect things more so than just, okay, you have this joint space narrowing or inflammation of the bones and joints. What kind of things are you doing with people typically when you see someone and they come in with some type of joint pain, say like, whatever it is? It could be neck, it could be upper back, it could be knee, elbow. What kind of things are you doing with them generally, or principles are you abiding by to try to help them feel better and get moving a little bit more?
I think one thing that's important in the assessment process. So let's say you have somebody who's got joint pain, and they may even have like an X-ray that shows that there is some joint deterioration. What you need on top of that is to actually see how the joint functions. So one of the ways to look at how the joint functions is, how's the range of motion in that joint? Is it very limited? If a lot of times, like, people will have, I see this in knees all the time, whereas they'll have this diagnosis of osteoarthritis because they have pain in their knee, but they have literally like no limitation in knee motion whatsoever, right? So it doesn't mean that the knee is like 100%, but it means like your knee has the potential to function just fine, right? This deterioration is not getting in the way of you moving your knee, which is a really good indicator. The other thing that I would look at, and you can kind of visualize this, is, to me, there's a bigger difference, and you can call it arthritis, but to me, it's its own like category. If somebody's got like a major deformity in a joint, right? So, you get wear and tear to the point where like a knee is really buckling in and there is an obvious malalignment, and not, like an obvious one. That's going to be a different treatment process. And you would expect that the joint will probably have a hard time functioning because of that. And then usually that couples with some type of loss of range of motion because the body's not starting in as much of a balanced position as it would if it didn't have that deformity. So those are two things that I'll just look at right off the bat, is like, what's the range of motion in the joint, and is there like obvious deformities? Because if there are, then then the diagnosis becomes a little bit more valuable, but it's a totally different process in my opinion there. So like you see somebody who has, for instance, like rheumatoid arthritis, which is a totally different type of arthritis, right? It's more of a systemic issue, but you'll usually see like very specific deformities in the hands. So that becomes like, even how we would be thinking about that might be a lot more likely to irritate if we do too much there. So we might have to be more gentle with those type of things. And we would expect not to have the full motion of the joint in those cases. But then after that, like our goal really should be to teach people how to vary their movement in ways that they're not varying it, with an understanding of like what's currently your biggest problem, like what's bringing your complaint on, what type of actions are. So can we do that a little bit differently? Can we build up your tolerance to the thing that you're having difficulty with little by little, just like we would build up your tolerance to lifting heavier weights if you didn't have pain, right? We just have to figure out like what is the provocative action and be able to put somebody into a movement continuum like we've talked about in episodes past. But if we just think about the idea of what could we do to decrease wear on a joint, well, it would be really to put less wear into that joint by varying up the way that we use the joint more frequently, as opposed to totally not using the joint and being sedentary, because that just, the whole organism then atrophies, right? And that certainly doesn't, we have good evidence that doesn't lead to any value in decreasing joint degradation or, muscular, it'll atrophy pretty much everything in the body in a negative way. But what we can think about is varying action is a different version of a form of rest to the joint. So instead of doing things the same way all the time, is figure out what we're doing too much of and have another way to create activity that is varied.
Yeah, I think another big part of this too is like just take into account, I mean, and we do this with everyone, but just like history and actual activity level too, because sometimes you have someone coming in with a diagnosis of osteoarthritis and like they've been even running like up to 10 miles a week or something, for example, and that person's going to be at a much different place and is probably more so along the lines of, okay, maybe this diagnosis doesn't correlate as much, versus like you mentioned, when you actually start to see some deformities at the joint and lack of motion, it may be more useful. But either way, it's not necessarily a death sentence, and there's always a way really to continue moving in some respect. And when you stop moving, that's when you kind of let these orthopedic problems develop into metabolic problems, for example. And that's just never a place that you want to be.
Absolutely. And I think that it's like another conversation there is like, when as clinicians do we start to think about, this person might be a good candidate for a joint replacement? Because that is the sort of the end game of, okay, I have this diagnosis of osteoarthritis, and that may go through a patient's head right away as soon as they get that. Well, inevitably, I'm going to have to get a new joint at some point. And we've done, like, the surgical world has really improved so much with joint replacements that you can get them and still be quite functional. But the thought is like, eventually we may have to say, yeah, you've tried the more conservative means. You actually are a good candidate for this. And I think it's when you lose joint motion, you've tried to get it back, right? So you don't want to just do one assessment of a joint and say, all right, well, your joint's limited, you probably need surgery, there's nothing you do. No, you try to get the joint motion back. And it's just, for whatever reason, it's not taking, right? There's too much pain. There's and then I think tied in, if there's an obvious deformity too, that in my experience tends to get in the way of trying to make some of these joint changes. That's where I think, people can become a candidate for surgery. But every time somebody gets a surgery, I think the thing to appreciate is there is no guarantee that if you had a pain problem, that the pain is going to go away with the surgery. It's an assessment, just like anything we'd be doing as clinicians. Every day we're assessing any intervention we give someone. Is it helpful? Is it making them better? Is it moving them towards better function? Well, the thing that's in a therapy process, like that assessment is much more dynamic and the stakes are much lower. They're less invasive, right? So with a surgery, it's, you're going to have this long rehab process. And sometimes you come back out of that rehab process way better. But you really want to make sure that you've tried other things beforehand, because we could be going through these mini assessments a lot easier during a rehab process, and be educating people on how they can do that themselves, which is going to be something they would need anyway after the surgery. But there is no guarantee that the surgery is the thing you needed. And I think that's the other thing that is really kind of evidence against the idea that, arthritis and pain are the same thing, is like, if that was the case, then every time somebody would get, a knee replacement that, something didn't go terribly wrong with, they would be better. And that just doesn't happen. A lot of people do get better. Some people, they might feel worse afterwards. A lot of people don't regain their joint range of motion back. And they might have their pain might change. Most likely their pain will change. Sometimes it's worse, sometimes it's better, but there's still some pain that's left. Things aren't hunky-dory all the time. You know what I mean? And I think that there has to be an explanation there, that there's absolutely indications for surgery, but it's an assessment just like anything else. Like, you're seeing, is this for me? Well, you got to go through the process and find out.
Yeah. And I think sometimes after surgery too, even if you feel better initially, someone might actually start to feel worse over time. And that's because oftentimes I think you go into surgery, you get this idea that you're going to get quote unquote fixed. You go through the rehab process, but then from a lifestyle standpoint, nothing actually changes. And you go back to kind of doing the exact same things. And that might tell you a little bit that, well, okay, maybe the surgery was necessary, but still it's these lifestyle factors that are kind of driving the pain potentially more so than what's actually happening locally at the knee, for example. And that's not to say surgery is not necessary. I think in cases it's absolutely necessary, but it's also just something, like you mentioned, that's more invasive, and it's something that can't be undone.
Right. Yeah. And it's just a piece a lot of times. Like, I would say almost every time, like, you can't do surgery in isolation and expect that, like, everything that you've been dealing with, so especially if it's a chronic condition, if you've been dealing with it for years, right, that surgery is going to take care of all of that, right? Like, so you're going to need some type of educational process, some type of therapeutic process on top of the surgery. So the surgery oftentimes can be an important piece of moving things forward, but it's not it's not like a one-to-one relationship where it's like, okay, this diagnosis, this surgery, it's going to work. And I think, again, that's a lot of times what people are looking for, is that simplicity, that if I get the diagnosis, then the healthcare professional knows exactly what to do, and I won't have to change anything. They'll just have to, change my joint and I'll be good as new. And that's not the reality of it, because the diagnosis itself was incomplete. And I think that, we just have to be able to separate that out. And it's, again, I'm not saying, neither of us are saying that surgery is not useful. It's certainly, we've seen enough cases where it's absolutely useful and it's absolutely necessary. But we've also understand that as therapists, we're a big piece of that puzzle afterwards too, after any joint replacement, right? Mm-hmm. And we if just left to your own devices, a lot of times you can see people's pain go down, their function might improve, but down the line, things are left, they're left unfixed in many ways, because stuff was never addressed, because it was should have been more than just a pain problem. It should have been looking at, like, how the joint's functioning as a whole. And oftentimes that doesn't get done. It certainly isn't going to get done with just the surgical process. You need motion on top of that. you need to understand where you were limited before the surgery and where you're certainly going to be limited after the surgery. And we have to also understand that we're functioning as a whole body, not just one joint that was giving you problems. So like if there's never a learning process that comes in, which doesn't happen with surgery, then you're probably going to be left with some of the same problems down the line.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the idea of varying activities in a way to offload certain joints, so that you're not just doing the same thing over and over again as a treatment strategy. Are you doing anything differently from a preventative perspective if anyone's listening and trying to prevent osteoarthritis, or does that is that the same thing? Like you're going to vary activity in a similar way?
Yeah, and I think that's just part of good programming and good fitness is to appreciate that, in order to get better at something, you do have to do something over and over again, but you also have to appreciate that there's like multiple ways that you can, work on a goal that slightly varies joint position, slightly varies intensity, and using your pain as a feedback to say like, okay, I'm feeling like I'm doing a little bit too much of this. I can easily switch gears into something else. That to me is all part of programming, is knowing that, there's going to be a time where you're not going to be doing the same thing. So if you're getting pain with running, well, it doesn't mean running is bad, but it might be, you might need a more versatile, workout and fitness regimen. And I think discussing the difference between health and also like competitive athletics is important too, right? If somebody's in the realm of just like trying to be really competitive and that's part of their livelihood, there's going to be more likelihood of overuse in the whole body, the joints being part of that, because you have to do more of the same thing over and over again, and there might be less room for variation because your livelihood, your job sort of depends on doing the same thing over and over again. But even in that process, then the goal would be to say, when you're training your fitness outside of your sport, is that don't do too much that looks like the sport that you're doing, to like try to have some variation in there so that your body can work maybe some of the systems that it's not getting, in the sport, like try to make your body more versatile, just from a standpoint of not even improving performance, but just to make you more resilient to all the wear and tear that you're going to take over a career. So I think it matters, like, are you in a realm where you can easily just change what you do? And I think most people are, like, it's just, we might not be thinking of it that way, because I think a lot of fitness ends up being an overflow for people's former athletic careers, where it's like, okay, this is how I used to think about sports, so now that's how I'm going to think about fitness, is that I'm just going to take on one or two tasks and get really good at them, or just do them longer, as opposed to trying to diversify your fitness, regimen, like you would diversify a good portfolio. You got to diversify your movements and try to get better at more things, as opposed to just trying to get like awesome at one thing.
Yeah, that's not as sexy of a process, because then you don't feel like you're amazing at this one thing. But I think being able to be general for the most part in your training, and in certain ways specialize in certain things, but it's like if you're only training one certain movement or one way, you're leaving a lot of things on the table, actually, probably from a performance perspective, but then also from a health perspective. There's room for opportunity there.
Yeah, I think versatility needs a better marketing coach, where instead of thinking of it as like being the best at, like, no, there's only one person that's the best at anything in the world, right? Like, just by nature, by definition, right? So, I think the idea of being versatile is a nice positive way to say have more variability in your movement, right? So you could be really good, and especially from the outside, you could be very fit in many realms. You're just not necessarily going to be elite, and being elite in one or several things is hard to do. So you usually need to be a little bit more targeted if you're going to be elite in anything. But you could be like damn good, and then from a fitness and health standpoint, especially as you get older, and like really what you're just trying to do is not deteriorate, like you'll feel pretty damn good about yourself just by being decent at a lot of different things, right? Because there's so many people around you that are just going to be getting worse at everything if they're not taking things on. And then if you're versatile, you may talk to that guy who isn't as strong as you, but tells you that they run like a better 5K or something. And you're like, all right, well, that's fine. Like I'm going to be okay with being, like not as good at one thing, so I could be more versatile at other things. But I do think like in the long run that starts to like less things start to fall off because you've kept you kept in the game in many realms. So I think it just needs like a better marketing pitch.
Yeah.
I'm saying like
It really does.
let's be versatile and take pride in being versatile as opposed to just trying to like be the best in some type of realm where you're not going to be the best anyway, right? And again, outside of any sports endeavor, like most people that are outside of athletics, they just need, I think, the education on thinking about things differently and thinking about, all right, it's you versus you. Take some baselines about where you are, but take many baselines and just see all of them get better. And pretty quickly, you feel better. Like you feel your energy is much better. But that is a natural way to create movement variability. Is things we've talked about in the past, like every like realm of the movement continuum. Can we do things for speed? Can we do things for strength? Can we do things for endurance? Just taking one movement and changing up all the different ways that you train that movement, like that's variability in itself that puts different intensities and different loads on joints. But then we can add multiple movements into that and go through all of the different factors that we've talked about before. And it's pretty easy to create variability, but you actually don't even have to do that many different movements because you could just vary up like how you're using those movements.
Mm-hmm. What's the saying? It's like jack of all trades, master of none, or something.
Yeah.
It's like you actually probably want to be that for training.
Yeah, especially when when you're thinking about the health realm and in the longevity realm, is learn new things because you can always be you're going to be better at something you've never learned before right away, pretty much because you had no reference for anything. And I think that becomes more and more important is to be open to trying new things. But that might become harder when we're looking at populations that might start to get the diagnosis of osteoarthritis, is that it's harder to change as you get a little bit older because you get more set in your ways. But that might be the time you need change most, is as soon as something is starting to become painful, well, that's an indication that your body wants you to change something, right? And down the line, that might look like, okay, joint degeneration. But again, based on our conversation, it's not the same thing, right? Like a pain has started, which is a signal to change something. If you are willing and able to change things and you have a program already set in place that you're used to varying, it's a lot easier to work around stuff.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
All right. Well, I think this is a complex discussion, but hopefully we shine some light on at least the way we think about it and the way that like our clinical experience has showed us like what's useful, what's not so useful. And we'll touch on some other common buzz diagnoses that we can talk about what they are, how to think about maybe some things that are very obvious mechanical ways to make adjustments to them, but also tie in the same conversation we had today about that it's the diagnoses are usually structural in nature, and it's not the same thing as the pain complaint. So we always have to appreciate that.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Well, we will get to it again next week. I'll see you then.
See you then.
Later.